Hey, economics students, how are you doing? Welcome back to Monday, and it's the first Monday of our first week of this new sort of learning schedule that we're putting together here at the high school. And so this week I have a different video that kind of explains that and a little bit of a notice on our Google Classroom. But as a reminder, we're just going to do two videos this week. The first video, we will meet together, each class, to sort of go over the assignment, answer any questions you have about it, maybe watch the video together. And there will be an assignment that I post with every video. Today's assignment is very simple. There's a Google form that just has 3 questions on it, and it's all about what's going on right now in our world, what's going on in America, because there's a lot of interesting things going on, and economically speaking, there's a lot of debate on what we should be doing or shouldn't be doing. And so today's lesson is all about what does the government do when there are market failures? What is the role of government? And then the assignment, it's very simple. It's sort of an opinion question, but you need to have some actual economic concepts backing up your opinion when you answer it. Do you think our government is doing the right thing? Our government has taken severe actions recently to try to mitigate possible market failures and to save people's lives, which again, if people are dying, that's not an allocation to try to save people's lives. And because if people, can't stay healthy, then resources don't flow in an economy. So it's kind of a weird way to look at humanity, but that's sort of economics for you. Let's go ahead. Let's get to our lesson. It starts out with an interesting video, and let's go ahead. We'll get to it. Let's watch this video together, and I will talk to you on the other side.
Denver 7's Lance Hernandez, who joins us now from the state capitol.
Well, it was a raucous crowd that gathered on the front lawn of the state capitol and caused a bit of gridlock on Lincoln Street, but they gathered to send a message to the governor. Let businesses reopen, let people go back to work.
Honking horns, revving engines.
God bless America.
Protesters by the hundreds gathering in front of the Capitol. Hundreds more motoring by on Lincoln Street, waving flags, using megaphones.
We don't need this. This is freedom. We're all out here together.
Demanding that Governor Jared Polis end the stay-at-home order by May 1st.
All day school!
Former State Representative Marsha Luper among them.
This state has been shut down long enough. There are families hurting, there are businesses hurting. We can't pay our bills, and the statistics don't support us staying shut down anymore.
Many of the protesters were a tad angry.
This is a great outcry from the people to show that we're tired of the that government is putting us through, that we're borderline tyranny.
I like to see the Constitution be restored and let us all go back to work and enjoy our restaurants. And if you're not comfortable with that, then you can make the choice to stay home, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Reaction on Twitter was swift. One person writing, "Whoever brought children without face masks to this gathering should be ashamed." Another tweeted, "If you're protesting the quarantine, please do our completely overworked medical system a favor and fill this out so we don't waste precious resources on you." The protesters not amused.
Here's the question. Does the response to this virus, does it match? Because the repercussions, the economic repercussions, are going to be way worse than any repercussions to the virus.
The Colorado State Patrol telling Denver 7 that 3 people were detained over some minor incidents, a couple of them involving a flag. They were then let go. Denver police say that this was a very loud operation, but peaceful. Lance Hernandez, Denver 7.
And so there you have it. You had a protest there in Denver, and there have been protests all over the state. There was one in Columbus last Thursday, I want to say. And what's happening is that there are some people in our country who think our government has done way too much. They've overreacted. And in the effort to save lives, they have restricted our economy. They've restricted the allocation of resources to an extent that we're actually doing more harm than good. There's Right now in the polls, it shows most people are more worried about opening up the economy too soon than too late. But there is a growing and very vocal group of Americans, and this is democracy in action, that they say our government needs to reopen the economy, that people are not getting the food they need, the money they need, they aren't going to be able to pay their rent, their mortgage, and that in totality, that is more damaging than the virus is. And so what we are going to do today, I'm going to go into sort of the Econ 101. This is what the government usually tries to do to stop market failures, and I'll go into some of the different ways the government can try to correct different types of market failures. And then for homework tonight, and again, you'll have after your class is done. So on Monday it's second period, on Tuesday it's fourth period, on Wednesday it's seventh period, sorry. You'll have 48 hours at the end of your particular class period to get the assignment done. This one should not take very long. And then we'll have a second assignment posted midweek, and then you'll have 48 hours to do the assignment for the second video halfway through the week. All right, so let's go ahead. Let's go over again, what is the government's role in correcting market failures? So again, if you remember, we've studied 4 different types of reasons markets can fail. One of the reasons markets fail, or they fail to provide resources efficiently, is when there is a firm or a market that does not have perfectly competitive structures. So if there is a firm, particularly a market that has a monopoly, or a firm that has a lot of monopoly power, traditionally speaking, monopolies can charge way more than is socially optimal and produce less of a product than is socially optimal. So what the government tries to do is the government does try to maintain competition in a market. And one of the biggest things that the government does is it tries to prevent monopolies from forming, at least monopolies that are non-efficient monopolies. And we're not going to get into what is the difference between efficient and non-efficient monopolies and all that stuff. But anyway, there is a government agency called the Federal Trade Commission, and one of its biggest responsibilities is to maintain competitive markets in our economy. And so again, it is a regulatory agency, meaning that it is a government agency that regulates economic activity. And it enforces the different legal regulations in economic activity, meaning there are certain laws that the government has passed over time to prevent monopolies from forming. And so what this agency does, it makes sure that in any sort of a market, whether it's monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, it makes sure that firms don't work together to or collude to fix prices super high at once. Make sure firms are competing with each other, not working together to make life harder on the consumers. One of the biggest role of the FTC is that when two or more companies merge together, the FTC looks at that merger, and these companies have to present paperwork and all sorts of things to the FTC, and the FTC looks at this merger, and if it feels that if these companies merge together, that if it's going to create a large company with too much monopoly power, it can stop the merger. Likewise, the FTC and the government can come in, and if it feels as though a company has become too powerful and has too much monopoly power in a market, they can actually break that up. They can break that company up into smaller pieces. So that's one of the ways the government tries to fix imperfect competition. The next thing that we had talked about were externalities, and externalities are when a producer and consumer make economic decisions that have either unintended positive, meaning positive or beneficial consequences to society, or unintended negative consequences. And generally speaking, the government tries to encourage positive externalities and stop negative externalities. Positive externalities is when people consume things they aren't doing as much benefit as they realize. So the government wants to make sure that anytime there's a positive externality, there is enough of it to make sure that we are optimizing social benefits. And so sometimes what the government does, if there is a certain good or service that produces a positive externality, the government will just go ahead and take over the production of that. They'll actually produce that service for society. A good example is the Postal Service. That is actually in the Constitution that the government has to provide the Postal Service, but the Postal Service, the Post Office, that is what we consider a positive externality, that when people have the ability to interact and communicate with each other, they're not just helping each other out, but when people make wise decisions, communicate together, it helps the economy out as a whole. So the government makes sure that everybody in the country has the ability to communicate through the U.S. Postal Service. School, public education, we'll go into that later, but public education has positive externalities. When you are very, very smart and well educated, it doesn't just help you, it helps the entire society out. If you become a really good doctor, it helps you because you get a paycheck and you get a lot of money, but it also helps society because you're keeping everyone healthy. And you need education to become a really good doctor. So public schooling is a positive externality. In other circumstances, the government will pay certain businesses to produce a lot. It'll give some sort of a subsidy to either producers or consumers. So like school vouchers are an example of government subsidies. We'll go over that in a different period. A good example of a government subsidy, back when the Toyota Prius first came out, and it's a fuel efficient car, and when cars are more fuel efficient, there's less carbon being put in the atmosphere, there's less pollution, so there's a positive externality. If somebody buys a fuel efficient car, they're doing it because they want to lower their prices and they like the car. All right. But when they buy a fuel efficient car, it doesn't only help them, but it helps the entire environment, and that helps everyone. So the government, when fuel efficient cars first came out, they gave a huge tax credit. So if you bought a Toyota Prius, you get like a $4,000 tax credit. And what that means is essentially the government is giving you $4,000 to buy that car. Now, giving is not necessarily the right word, but for the sake of this slide, we're going to go with that. The other thing is a government wants to limit negative externalities. So if there is any sort of a market that produces negative externalities, such as pollution is a negative externality, the government will create laws and agencies to either stop or limit a certain amount of production, or it will tell producers a certain way they need to produce their product to limit that negative externality. So a regulation was the government steps in and tells businesses how or how much to produce. A good example, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to try to stop pollution, they set certain standards, they set certain guidelines that companies are not allowed to produce a certain amount of pollution. They limit the amount of pollution a company can produce. Another good example, another federal agency, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the NHTSA. This is the government agency that is in charge of highway safety and car safety. And so they also regulate the production of cars. They say that cars have to be produced with certain safety standards. Every car needs to have seat belts. Every car needs to have, I think every car needs to have at least a certain number of airbags. I'm not 100% sure on that. Every car has to meet certain pollution standards. So that is an example of the government stepping in and telling how the business to produce their product, that businesses have to produce their product in a specific way if they're producing cars. And another thing the government will try to do to stop a negative externality is that they will step in and they will sometimes levy taxes on businesses that are producing. And the idea is that when government levies taxes, that causes the business either to produce less or consumers have to consume less because taxes might cause the price of the product to rise depending upon different variables. So again, a tax levied against a business that pollutes is a way to stop a business from polluting as much. Taxes on cigarette companies is another good example. It causes people to not buy as many cigarettes because there's a negative externality of that. Likewise, markets fail to provide public goods and services, and this one's pretty straightforward. If the government feels there is a good or a service that is a public good or service that the market is not creating enough of, it will usually step in and provide that good or service. It'll take tax dollars and provide goods and services. Sort of gone through this. The post office is a good example. Public schools is somewhat of a good example. So let's look at public schools, for example. So public education versus public schools. Schooling and education are two very different things. You can be educated without ever attending a school. Education is kind of like the act of being educated, the act of gaining valuable and applicable information to use to help you in the future. There are plenty of people who are well educated. They read a lot of books. They stay very informed, watch a lot of things, and do a lot of hands-on learning through their employments. They are very well educated and know a lot about certain topics, even though they may not have gone to school for and gotten a doctorate degree in certain subjects. So school and education are two different things. Public education is a public good. If I am educated, all right, it is non-rival. If I am educated, it doesn't stop anyone else from being educated. As I consume education, as I read a book, I get utility out of it. It doesn't stop anybody else from reading that same book and getting utility. Public education is also relatively non-excludable. Anybody can go to the library and grab a book. Anybody can, access ways to gain information. Schools are not public goods, though. They are very excludable. There can only be so many students in a classroom. All right, I can only get 30 kids into my classroom. After that, we have to start excluding people. And it's relatively easy. If we wanted to exclude students, it'd be pretty easy to just say, sorry, you're not allowed in the school, we're full. So schools are excludable. But public schools are the mechanisms that we have used to provide the public good of education. So there are some people who say that we can better provide public education if we get rid of public schools and we just have a lot of private schools, and then the government can give families vouchers, give families money to choose which private school they want their kids to go to. And that way private schools will be competing with each other. Right now there isn't a lot of competition in terms of academics between public schools. At least that's what some economists say, and that public schools are not the most efficient way to provide public education. It's more of a conservative theory of education. There's obviously some other theories that say it's the best way to provide equal schooling for all students is to have public schools. And then finally, we've talked about the fourth market failure is information asymmetry. The idea is that resources are not allocated efficiently if people don't know what they're buying. All right, so if you aren't familiar with a used car that you're about to buy and you don't know that it's been in 10 car accidents and that it's a clunker, you're going to spend more money on it than you should. And what that is, that's a waste of resources. That's money that you could be using. Those are resources you could be using to maximize your utility elsewhere. Instead, you're using it to buy a cruddy car simply because you didn't have the information about the car. So information asymmetry is another way that markets fail. And essentially, what the government tries to do to correct these market failures, they step in. There are many government agencies. Most of the ones are the same ones that we had sort of seen in previous slides that also regulate businesses. One of the regulations that they usually make is to make sure we as consumers have information about products. All right, so the government makes sure that when a producer is selling something, you as a consumer have the ability to be informed on what it is you are buying. A good example is nutrition labels. So the government agency is called the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. That government agency makes sure that all the food that you buy has certain labels on it so you know what you're getting so that you can maximize your utility. School report cards. The Ohio Department of Education forces schools. Well, they force schools to give certain information to taxpayers about how good they are doing, and we call these school report cards. Not the ones that you take home, but we as school districts actually have report cards that are on the web that we mail out to families that are accessed on the Ohio Department of Education website, and it lets parents know how good their schools are doing. That way, if a parent wants to enroll their students into a different school, or maybe try to get school vouchers to send their kids to private schools, they know which ones they want to send them to. So this is sort of an idea of trying to get good information out into the hands of parents. If you want to buy stock, in other words, if you want to own part of a corporation and buy stock, every 3 months, corporations have to release an earnings report. And what that is, that's meant to make sure that you as a stockholder have all the information of the business that you have ownership in. When you own stock, you essentially are a small owner of a particular corporation. And by the government agency, the Security Exchange Commission, SEC, this is the government agency that requires and mandates corporations release stock earnings reports so that people know what they are buying when they buy stock. If you ever go and buy a new car or a used car, there's certain information that needs to be on what's called the sticker, the little sheet of paper in the window that usually has the price and other information. And again, it's the government agency, the National Highway Transportation and Safety Administration. That is the government agency that mandates that there is certain information that you need to be given before you buy a new or used car. And the rules are a little bit different between new and used, but that's something different. So again, that's pretty much it. That's sort of the basics. In another lesson, about 2 weeks, we'll go into other ways the government tries to help maintain our economy, but those are the key ways that the government tries to correct the market failures that we have learned about. So for your assignment tonight, tomorrow, whenever you get to it, and you don't have to do a whole lot, I want you to review those 4 market failures. Monopoly power, meaning imperfectly competitive markets. That's the first market failure. Externalities. Public goods, and information asymmetry. Those are the 4 things that markets usually struggle with the most when they allocate resources. And the government tries to step in to make sure that resources are allocated as efficiently as possible when one of those 4 or more than one of those 4 things occur in a market. Because a lot of times a market failure can't just be attributed to one of those particular 4. Sometimes markets fail because of a combination of those 4 reasons. And so right now the government has stepped in severely. You recognize this. The government has stepped in and has essentially told everyone you need to stay locked in your house until further notice, unless you're essential and you really need to get out to go get some groceries or what have you. And the reason they're doing that is that they're afraid if they don't, there will be a virus that kills a lot of people, and that would destroy our economy as well. So the government has stepped in to maintain our safety, because that in the long term maintains a healthy economy, because we are the laborers that are needed to as one of the factors of production. So my question to you is, first, which of these market failures do you feel the government is trying to correct? Is the government stepping in because they think there's a negative externality that's going on? Is it because of public goods? Is there some public good that isn't being produced? Is it because there's too much monopoly power in some sort of a market? Is that why the government's just stepping in? Or is the government stepping in because we don't have adequate information? There's asymmetric information or not enough information for a market to work appropriately. Which of those 4 reasons do you feel the government has been stepping in? All right, and then the last thing I want you to do is just explain, do you think the government has done the right thing? All right, has the government's actions helped prevent catastrophic market failure, which is, when we say catastrophic market failure in this circumstance, we're talking about a large pandemic that would kill a lot of people, whereas the government stepped in and done too much? Has it actually done more harm than good? Should the government reopen the economy at the risk of respreading the virus or spreading the virus even more? Because by shutting the economy down, we're actually doing more harm than good. So what's your thoughts? All right, so tell me that on our Google form. I'm excited to hear what your general thoughts are, and I will be talking to you in our Google Meets this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, depending on what period I have you. And then our second lesson will be posted midway through the week. And that lesson is kind of interesting. It's sort of the idea of, can you put a price tag on human life? Because that's kind of what we're doing right now when we say let's reopen the economy. We're kind of putting a price tag on human life. And can you really do that? Or is human life what we would say invaluable? So we'll talk about that some other time. Hope you're doing well, and I will see all of you very soon. Bye.